In this video we want to tease out an interpretation of the utilitarian theory that is not commonly discussed. To do so, we choose to utilize a thought experiment, at the end of which we will clearly spell out the idea it is getting at. Let's begin our experiment by imagining we have a brand new copy of Earth, a tabula rasa, where we scatter some conscious humanoid creatures. And let's assume that as a moral compass, we endow these creatures with the utility principle. Not in the sense that all will be perfect utilitarians, rather that if they decide to be moral, they would attempt to follow the utility principle, but they can still act immorally or amorally. Simply, their unconscious notion of good would be delineated by the utilitarian principle. In other words, we could say that they use the same guiding principle if they want to do good, but they can be more or less in tune with it. Of course, they are not told any of this, and at the start of their existence in this new world, they might not even have a word for morality, since they are going to have to discover language, think about feeding themselves, make scientific discoveries, etc., etc. Now, let's imagine this world evolving through time, with a focus on customs, norms, and moral beliefs. What would happen? How would the norms of these creatures evolve as time goes on? We can imagine that at the beginning, for those that wish to do good, it would not be that easy to maximize happiness for all. The best way to do it would probably be, as a starter, to maximize their own happiness by finding food and discovering the natural resources the world has to offer. The conscious beings would also quickly discover that congregating together would be conducive to the maximization of happiness. In fact, the Earth has natural predators, and being in numbers seems like a smart way to fend them off, in addition to many other benefits. So conscious beings that are in close proximity to one another may tend to group together. This would lead to the quick discovery that congregating together can also have its disadvantages, especially if some members of the group steal food or kill other members. This creates a big problem with regards to the maximization of happiness for all. It is also hard to know a priori who could act immorally. One possible solution that may become an unwritten societal norm is that if one member of the group acts immorally, the other members could forcefully discipline him for his behavior. This quite violent societal norm could be thought to create more happiness, in that it would discourage negative utility acts, and at an early stage of civilization it may very well be the case. An application of the principle of utility seems to lead to the idea of punishment, or in these primordial settings, violent retribution. Interesting. Let's continue. Another societal norm that might appear to generate happiness is that of dividing labor. The male humanoids are better physically equipped for certain tasks, like hunting for food, while the females can keep watch on the young. So a norm regarding gender roles could be productive for creating happiness, and in these primitive societies it might gain acceptance. In a similar manner, other norms could be born out from the desire to maximize happiness for all. For example, a norm on borders. The humanoids might understand that a certain territory produces a certain amount of food, so they would make rough calculations on how much land they need to feed their group, and then tend to that territory. Continuing in this way, many customs could stem from utilitarian reasoning. Respecting your elders. In general, they have more knowledge than the young. Identifying a leader so that decisions can be taken more swiftly and efficiently, and so on and so on. Of course, not all tribes would develop the same customs through utilitarian reasoning. This would be due to the different initial conditions and information sets they have. We could even imagine opposite norms being created. For example, a tribe might be dancing one night, and the next day rain would come pouring. So they might develop a custom based on the fact that dancing can influence rain. If it was true, it would be quite useful. While another group could believe that being still and silent could heighten the chances of rain. Also, it's easy to think that with a limited information set available, not all customs that originate with intent of producing happiness would actually produce happiness. For example, some groups could initially develop a norm to simply put all the dead in one place, without burying them, since that would be extra work, to then quickly discover that this attracts predators and spreads disease. Other norms created with the idea of maximizing happiness, but producing negative utility, could be more pernicious to figure out. For example, after noticing people recovering from sickness being in close proximity to the fire while eating seaweed, some shamanistic beliefs could take place, with the idea that fire and salt may have some healing power. It would be hard to recognize that this belief does not actually bring utility, especially if the humanoids are biologically subject to confirmation biases. Another example of a negative utility norm originating could occur if there was homosexuality between the humanoids. Some groups might erroneously believe it's a disease that could be transmitted, or that it could lead to the destruction of their small societies, thus establishing norms repressing the practice. In essence, it seems apparent that the combination of utilitarian reasoning with a limited information set could also lead to norms that create unhappiness. Okay, so far so good. Now, let's think about the time dimension. Through the course of time, it seems natural to assume that more norms would be created, and with different conditions, maybe technological improvements, some norms that were initially producing happiness could stop doing so. Thus, some traditions could be abandoned, others refined. For instance, the punishment for certain crimes could be scaled down, thanks to the creation of law enforcement branches. An eye for an eye rules could be revisited. In this way, norms and laws would be in this loop of creation, refinement, and pruning, due to the constant search of a maximization of happiness. Pondering on this experiment even further, one could also suppose that some humanoids start thinking that they should identify the rules and norms that bring more happiness and communicate them to most people as possible. This would in fact be a positive utility action. Also, some people do not care for societal rules, and it would be good if they could be convinced in some way to obey them. Maybe they could say that a greater powerful being in the sky told them the positive utility social norms. That seems like an astonishing idea. Then even people who aren't in touch with their moral compass might be convinced by such a divine account. And thus religion is born. Okay, the experiment is getting out of hand. As you might have guessed, what we are trying to showcase is that given a utilitarian moral compass to a conscious population, the evolution of their customs could turn out very similar to that of humanity. What the experiment aims to provide is a brief historical interpretation of the evolution of norms, traditions, and moral beliefs, based on the utilitarian principle. The utilitarian theory, considered as an infant, descriptive theory of ethics, seems to have a remarkable explanatory power. That is, if one wanted to model human moral beliefs as a physical phenomenon, it seems like building on the utility principle would be a promising way to go. One could say, being as concise as possible, that we are stating that the utility principle descriptively guides ethics. An attempt to formalize this intuition could be that of modeling the evolution of morality through a signal plus noise paradigm. The signal would be the constant effect of the common moral compass given by the utility principle, and the noise would be created by all the other exogenous variables that differ from group to group. If the variance of the noise term is high, the evolution of moral beliefs between tribes might appear random, but actually they are following an underlying principle. One could go as far as claiming that every custom and norm could be subsumed by this paradigm. For us, we limit ourselves in saying it seems like the utilitarian theory provides a good starting point for a descriptive model regarding the evolution of moral beliefs. This is a structuralist interpretation in the sense that it aims to uncover an underlying structure within human cultures. Postmodernists don't like these kinds of interpretations very much, but that is another story. If this interpretation has some validity, we could also reach some conclusions on how we may improve the norm creation process, being that, simplifying a bit, it is essentially the result of three things: the amount of people that are in tune with the utility principle, the information set available to the group, and the resources a group has. Increasing any of these factors, the first through education, the second and third through scientific discovery, would produce happiness by aiding in originating positive utility norms. Okay, we have made our point regarding the descriptive explanatory power of the utility principle. Now we wish to address three immediate critiques of this account that could come to mind. The first is, what about slavery? What about the differences in religious doctrines? What about custom X? What about custom Y? Well, we have seen that at the beginning of civilization, where there were no prisons and not enough resources to create them, punishments for norm breaking could be quite brutal. An idea for a different kind of punishment could be that of instead of killing the norm breaker, he could be forced to work for another person, becoming his slave. In this way, the slave owner functions as a warden for the rule breaker. Both the slave and the slave owner could be thought to be happier with this kind of arrangement rather than spilling blood. So we can find utilitarian-guided explanations even for the origins of slavery. The utilitarian explanation could also illuminate some customs regarding slavery that may seem hypocritical to our modern eyes, like the rules on how to treat a slave well inscribed in the Hammurabi Code. Instead, regarding religious differences, it's true there are many religions with a lot of distinctions from one another. But even the most staunch advocates for considering them as separate entities, like Stephen Prothero, have to admit that they all attempt in some way to ethically guide the behavior of human beings towards states of higher well-being. With our interpretation, religion originates as a utilitarian instrument with the goal of increasing happiness by preaching the obeyment of the rules and their diffusion through rites and ceremonies. Churches serve as a repository for the societal rules and orally repeat the norms to keep them fresh in people's minds. Now in this account, we wish to stress one point again. We are not stating that the combination of a utilitarian moral compass with limited information sets and different initial conditions always gives rise to societal norms that produce happiness. Furthermore, the rules that once produced happiness may not do so anymore, along with the institutions that support them. A full analysis of the connection between the utilitarian principle and each religion is out of the scope of this video. Maybe in the future we will come back to this. Now we move on to other objections of this type. But what about the custom of the Kayans to elongate their neck with brass coils? How does that have anything to do with increasing happiness? Well, some anthropologists hypothesize that the rings protected women from becoming slaves, making them less attractive to other tribes. But what about the Polterabend custom in Germany, in which just before couples are wed, their families and close friends smash dinner plates that have to be then cleaned up by the couple? Well, it could be useful as a custom to remind people who are getting married about overcoming difficult times. But what about... Okay, we can't possibly go through every single custom. In the end, we acknowledge that there might be some norms that originate outside the utilitarian paradigm we have presented, even if they seem hard to come about. In any case, even the best explanatory models don't usually capture the phenomenon perfectly. The second criticism we want to address is the following. The way we have been utilizing the utility principle to guide the creation of customs and norms, it seems like we could justify anything this way. It is too loose of a connection. No norm we can think about can escape the paradigm, therefore the explanatory power is non-existent. We believe this objection to be fallacious, and to prove it we exhibit hypothetical norms that can't be traced to the utility principle. For example, a custom not performed to get in the good graces of any god, to blind every second child. This would be antithetical to the utility principle. Another example would be a custom that was totally random, lol, like that of dressing each day with a specific colour because a boy once found 7 different coloured rocks in a river, or even a custom that simply is, with no reason at all. These would be cases that escape the paradigm and that render the interpretation falsifiable. And finally, the last criticism, that can be summarized by who cares? The utilitarian framework promises to be a normative model of morality, not a descriptive one, so even if it does have some explanatory power regarding the creation and evolution of moral beliefs, who cares? The utilitarian framework should tell us how we ought to act, not describe how we act. Furthermore, if the utilitarian principle brought us all these discordant moral beliefs and originated violent norms, this historical interpretation seems like it could be used against the framework itself. Well, first, if a normative model has the characteristic that it is easier or more natural for human beings to follow, we score that as a plus for the model, since a normative model should be accessible to have some practical usefulness. Second, the reason for the existence of most norms, and the violence required to enforce them, is a consequence of the fact that not everyone is in tune with the utilitarian principle. In a utopic world, if everyone behaved according to the utilitarian principle, there would be less need for norms. But we will discuss this final criticism more in another video. Here we leave it at this. Happy to have provided this interpretation of the evolution of our moral beliefs.